The rain hadn't stopped for hours, drumming relentlessly against the roof in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant streetlights flickering in the downpour. I was about to shut my window when I saw her, hunched, trembling, her thin body barely more than a shadow beneath my porch light. A stray cat, drenched to the bone, her fur clinging to her frail frame. Raindrops slid off her whiskers as she stared up at me, unblinking, her eyes large and desperate. For a moment I hesitated. I wasn't prepared for this, but the sight of her, so small and defenseless, stirred something deep inside me. I grabbed an old towel and opened the door just enough to set it down. She took a step forward, hesitant yet trusting. I thought I was offering her shelter for a single night. I had no idea she'd return a week later, with her kittens. The moment she stepped inside, I saw just how fragile she was. Her fur, once a dusty gray, was darkened by the rain, sticking to her ribs in uneven clumps. Water dripped from her tail, pooling on the wooden floor. She didn't bolt or hiss, just stood there, exhausted, blinking up at me as if trying to decide whether she had made a mistake. I crouched down, moving slowly so I wouldn't startle her. "You must be freezing," I murmured, placing the towel within reach. She sniffed it cautiously before stepping onto the fabric, kneading it with tired paws. I could see her shoulders relax, just slightly. I moved back to give her space, letting her decide what happened next. She hesitated then, as if giving in, lowered herself onto the towel and curled into a tight ball. Her shivers slowly faded. I sat down on the floor, watching her, wondering where she had come from, whether she had a home, or if she had ever known one. The storm outside continued, wind rattling against the windows, but inside there was only silence. She must have been starving, yet she didn't move when I set down a small plate of leftover fish. She just closed her eyes. She had chosen rest over food. That night, I kept the door slightly open, unsure if she would stay. By morning, she was gone. I thought it was over. I was wrong. A week later, she came back, with 3 tiny kittens in tow. It was early morning when I heard the sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, like the distant cry of something fragile and searching. Half asleep, I dismissed it as the restless wind slipping through the cracks of my door. But then it came again, quieter this time, wavering like a whisper on the edge of dawn. Something in that sound reached me, pulling me from the last remnants of sleep, and before I could think, my feet were already moving toward the door. As I pulled it open, the cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the fading traces of last night's rain. And then I saw her, Hannah. She stood just beyond the threshold, her thin frame still marked by the struggle of survival. But there was something different about her now. She wasn't alone. At her feet, nestled against the wooden planks of the porch, were 3 impossibly small figures. Kittens, no more than a week old, their fur still damp from the misty air. They clung to one another, their tiny limbs trembling as they pressed closer for warmth, their unopened eyes searching blindly for the mother who had carried them here. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Hannah's green eyes locked onto mine, her expression unreadable, her body poised in a strange balance between exhaustion and determination. It wasn't the desperate plea I had seen in her before. It was something steadier, heavier, as if she had already made a decision long before she arrived at my doorstep. She had brought them here, for me. A choice, a question, a silent offering of trust. Kneeling down, I hesitated, my breath catching as I reached toward the trembling little bodies. They were heartbreakingly small, their tiny paws twitching, their fur matted from the journey. One was a pale shade of gray, its soft body curling instinctively into itself. Another was golden, its tiny head jerking up in a slow, aimless search. The third was darker than the night, its breath coming in quiet, uneven little puffs. They didn't shrink away as my fingers brushed against them, didn't flinch as I gently scooped them into my hands. Hannah watched me, her tail flicking once before she stepped forward, pressing her damp nose to my wrist as if sealing some unspoken agreement. I had no idea what I was doing, no idea how to care for a mother and her newborns, no idea what this meant for either of us. But as I carried them inside, as the warmth of their tiny bodies pulsed against my skin, I understood one thing. Neither of us had planned for this, yet somehow, this moment had found us both. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm of whispered uncertainty and cautious adaptation. The kittens, still blind to the world, spent most of their time nestled against their mother, their tiny breaths rising and falling in soft, rhythmic waves. Hannah, despite the weight of exhaustion pressing into her fragile frame, was fiercely protective, curling her body around them in an unbreakable shield of warmth. I watched from a careful distance, not wanting to disrupt the fragile bond between them, yet unable to pull myself away. Each moment felt like a revelation. Every twitch of their ears, every trembling stretch of their legs, every time Hannah fixed me with those watchful green eyes, as if assessing whether I truly understood what I had stepped into. But the twist came suddenly, slipping into the quiet like an unexpected storm. That morning, as I placed a small bowl of food near Hannah's resting place, I noticed it, an unnatural stillness among the kittens. Yuki, the smallest of the three, wasn't moving. A deep, sinking feeling coiled inside me as I reached down, my fingers trembling as they brushed against her fur. She was warm, but barely. Her tiny body, usually stirring with soft little stretches, remained frighteningly limp. Hannah let out a low, uneasy murmur, nudging the kitten with her nose, but there was no response. Panic flared inside me, a sharp and unfamiliar weight pressing against my ribs. I had no experience with this. I had barely adjusted to the idea of caring for them, and now, just as quickly as they had come into my life, I was faced with the possibility of loss. The moment stretched endlessly, the weight of it pressing against my chest, slowing my breath, making every movement feel distant, as though I were wading through water. Yuki lay still in the curve of Hannah's body, impossibly small, frighteningly quiet. The other two kittens wriggled in their sleep, their tiny paws twitching as they nestled closer, unaware of the fragile battle unfolding beside them. Hannah, her instincts razor-sharp, kept nudging Yuki with her nose, her ears flattening as a low, troubled sound rumbled in her throat. It was unlike anything I had heard from her before. Not a cry, not a demand, but something deeper, more primal. An unspoken plea born from the part of her that understood loss in ways I never could. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above Yuki's frail form, afraid to touch her, afraid to confirm what I feared. My mind scrambled for answers. Was she sick? Was she too weak? Had I done something wrong? I had never dealt with something so delicate, so precarious, and yet in that moment, hesitation was a luxury I couldn't afford. Carefully, I scooped her into my hands, feeling the feeble rise and fall of her tiny chest against my palm. She was alive, but barely. The helplessness swelled inside me, raw and unfamiliar. My first instinct was to rush to the vet, to hand this fragile life over to someone who knew what to do, but a glance at Hannah stopped me. She was watching, ears pinned, her body tense, as if trying to decide whether to trust me with what she had given. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just my decision. It was ours. Time became a fragile, ticking thing, each second stretching unbearably as I cradled Yuki's weightless body in my hands. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, the rise and fall of her chest barely perceptible against my skin. I could feel the warmth of Hannah's gaze on me, sharp and assessing, her body poised on the edge of motion, torn between instinct and trust. The other two kittens stirred against her, blissfully unaware of the urgency crackling in the space between us. I swallowed hard, forcing my own panic down, trying to think. I needed help. My mind raced through possibilities. Was there a vet nearby that I could rush her to? But even if there was, would they take in a stray kitten without any records, without a mother who would willingly part from her? And what if the worst had already taken hold? If whatever was making Yuki weak was beyond fixing? Doubt clawed at me, whispering that I wasn't equipped for this, that I had no place trying to play savior when I had never done this before. Just as the thought rooted itself in my mind, a sudden knock at the door jolted me back to the present. The sound was abrupt, cutting through the thick silence of the room, and I hesitated before shifting Yuki gently into a blanket-lined box. When I opened the door, I found Ayumi, my neighbor, standing in the misty morning air. Her eyes flickered to my hands, then past me, toward the mother cat curled around her remaining kittens. She frowned. "You need help," she said, her voice certain. "Tell me everything." And just like that, the weight I had been carrying was no longer mine alone. Ayumi stepped inside without hesitation, her presence slipping into the space as naturally as the soft morning light filtering through the rain-streaked window. She knelt beside the makeshift bed where Hana and the kittens lay, her careful hands brushing over the blanket as she studied Yuki's tiny form with quiet urgency. I had always known her as the kind of person who spoke little but understood much, someone whose steady presence felt like a quiet current. Never forceful, but always pulling you toward a direction you hadn't considered. And now, as she turned to me with a look that was both firm and questioning, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what she had to say. "She's weak," Ayumi murmured, cradling Yuki's fragile body in her palms, her fingers impossibly gentle. "She might not make it." The words landed like a slow, sinking weight, pressing into my ribs, heavy with reality. I watched as Hana shifted restlessly, her ears flicking toward us, her tail curling tighter around her remaining kittens. There was no fear in her, no panic, only the quiet, unshaken patience of a mother who had lived through too much to waste time on what-ifs. I swallowed, my voice quieter than I intended. "What do we do?" Ayumi exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "That depends. How much are you willing to fight for her?" And suddenly, it wasn't just about Yuki. It was about all of them. It was about me. The question lingered in the air, heavier than the humidity clinging to the walls. "How much are you willing to fight for her?" I had no answer, not yet, but the weight of it settled deep, pressing against something raw and uncertain inside me. I wasn't just deciding Yuki's fate. I was stepping into something far greater, something I had never prepared for. Ayumi didn't wait for me to respond. She was already moving, her hands steady as she adjusted the blanket around Yuki's fragile body, her eyes scanning the dim room as if cataloging the situation in her mind. "She's cold, too cold," she murmured. "Newborns can't regulate their body heat. If we don't warm her up, she won't make it to the vet." Hana stirred at the sound of our voices, her green eyes sharp, watchful, her ears flicking back as she let out a low, uncertain hum. She had trusted me enough to bring her babies here, but now as I reached toward the kitten she had carried into my life, I could feel the invisible thread between us tighten, balancing between understanding and instinct. Then the tension shattered. A sudden, sharp yowl pierced the air from outside, a raw, guttural sound that sent Hana's ears flat against her skull. She tensed, her tail bristling, her body coiling in quiet alarm. Ayumi and I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, threading through the misty morning like a warning. Someone, or something, was out there, watching. The air inside the room shifted, thickening with something unseen yet palpable, a tension that crackled just beneath the surface. Hana's posture had changed. She was no longer the weary mother curled protectively around her young. She was something sharper now, something instinctual and alert, her muscles taut, her gaze fixed on the door with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. The sound outside hadn't come again, but its echo lingered, threading through the silence like an unspoken warning. I exchanged a glance with Ayumi, whose brows furrowed as she slowly rose to her feet. She was listening, the way someone listens when they are no longer sure they are alone. My own pulse had quickened, my body on edge, but my focus kept pulling back to the frail warmth cradled in my hands. Yuki. She was still breathing, but barely, her tiny chest rising and falling in fragile, uneven beats. Whatever was happening outside, it couldn't matter more than this. Not now, not when she was slipping away by the second. But then Hana moved. She rose fluidly, stepping over her remaining kittens, her tail low, her movements quiet but deliberate. She didn't hiss or growl, didn't make a sound at all, just watched the door, her ears flicking towards something only she could sense. A cold wave passed through me. Ayumi took a cautious step forward, her voice low. "Someone left her out there once," she murmured. "What if they've come back?" The words sent a ripple of unease through me. I had thought I was saving her, thought I had given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. But what if I had only interrupted something that wasn't meant to end? A second yowl, closer this time, pressing against the thin walls of my home. The kittens stirred, their tiny bodies pressing into the warmth of the blankets. Hana didn't move, neither did I. Something, or someone, was waiting outside. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself, thick and waiting, pressing against the walls like a storm about to break. Hana's body was still, every muscle tensed, her tail flicking low, her ears straining toward the unseen presence beyond the door. The kittens stirred against the blankets, their tiny oblivious forms curling into each other for warmth, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding in the air around them. My hands tightened around Yuki, feeling the frail weight of her in my palms, her breath still weak, still fading, as if time itself were peeling her away from me in slow, aching increments. Ayumi took another step toward the door, her fingers ghosting over the handle before she hesitated, her brows pinched in a quiet, unspoken calculation. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, wasn't the type to let fear rule her. But something about this, the unnatural stillness outside, the way Hana's body had sharpened into something more primal, something prepared, made her pause. That, more than anything, made my skin prickle. Then another sound, not the eerie guttural yowl from before, but something softer, closer, a rustling, a shift of weight, footsteps. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. What if it's just another stray? My voice was barely above a whisper, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Something about this felt wrong, out of place. Strays didn't wait at doors. They didn't announce themselves with deliberate, lingering silence. Ayumi exhaled through her nose, then, in one swift movement, unlocked the door and pulled it open. The morning mist curled around the threshold, swirling in the dim light. And there, standing just beyond the step, was a cat. But not just any cat. It was larger than Hana, its fur a patchwork of scars and battle-worn age, its yellow eyes sharp and piercing, locked onto hers with something deeper than mere recognition. Hana stiffened. She knew him. And suddenly, this wasn't just about me, or Ayumi, or the kittens struggling for life inside my home. This was about her past, the one she had never chosen to speak of, the one that had now come knocking. For a moment, everything was still. The air between Hana and the scarred tomcat stretched tight, thick with something unspoken, something I could feel but not understand. The way she stood, her body taut but unmoving, her tail stiff, her ears half-pinned, not in fear, not in submission, but in something closer to resignation. As if she had been expecting this, as if she had known he would come for her eventually. The tomcat didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes, golden and razor-sharp, remained locked on Hana with an intensity that made my breath hitch. He wasn't just another stray passing through. He was here for her. Ayumi's fingers twitched at her side, her body angled slightly in front of mine, protective in a way she probably wasn't even aware of. "This isn't random," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "They know each other." Hana's body quivered, not in fear but in conflict. She took half a step forward, then stopped herself, her tail curling tighter. The tomcat let out a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a meow, something between a command and a question. I realized, with a sharp pang in my chest, that I had never seen Hana hesitate before. She had been cautious, she had been guarded, but she had never been unsure. Yuki stirred in my hands, her breath still weak, still fading. I swallowed hard. "Hana," my voice barely made it out. "Is this your mate?" She turned to me then, eyes unreadable, something deep and tangled flickering beneath them. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. The tomcat stepped forward, crossing the threshold just enough for the mist to curl around his paws. His gaze flicked to the kittens huddled behind Hana. He looked at them, and for the first time, his hardened face softened. A terrible, quiet realization settled into my bones. He wasn't here for her. He was here for them. The space between them was thick with something weighty and unspoken, a battle waged not in snarls or raised fur but in silence, in the subtle, imperceptible shifts of bodies on edge. Hana was rigid, yet not afraid. The tomcat, battle-worn and weathered by time, held himself with a quiet certainty that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. This was not the posturing of a feral stray, not a challenge issued for dominance. No, this was something deeper, heavier, a presence that did not demand, but rather expected. And in that expectation, I saw the unshakable truth that made my stomach turn. He was not here for her. He was here for them. The weight of that realization pressed down on me like an anchor. Had I misunderstood everything? Had I believed I was saving Hana when, in reality, I had simply taken her from something that was never meant to be severed? The way she held herself, frozen, calculating, not recoiling yet not stepping forward either, sent a cold ripple through my spine. She was deciding, and it was not an easy decision. It was a war of instincts clashing within her, a pull between survival and something older, something more primal, an obligation etched into the very marrow of her being. I wanted to step forward, to reach out, to assure her that she did not have to leave, that she did not owe anything to a past that had abandoned her to the rain. But that same past now stood before her, unshaken, unrelenting, and though the tomcat's expression remained unreadable, there was something in the way he held himself that made my throat tighten. This was not a negotiation. He had come to reclaim what he believed was his, and in that moment, I felt the sickening uncertainty that I had no right to decide what belonged to whom. Ayumi's presence beside me was steady, yet I could sense the tension rippling beneath her quiet composure. She was waiting for me to act, waiting for a decision that I wasn't sure belonged to me at all. The air between us had grown suffocating, stretching unbearably thin as Hana's tail flicked once, twice, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a deep unease rolling through my chest. And then, she took a step forward. My pulse slammed against my ribs, a breath caught somewhere in my throat. She was moving toward him, drawn by something I could not see, something beyond my understanding, beyond my control. For a brief, terrible second, I thought she would go, that she would walk past me, past the threshold, out into the mist-laden world where he waited. But then, just as quickly as she had moved, she stopped. Her body twisted slightly, her head lowering, her nose brushing against the small, trembling forms of her kittens. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet in it something changed. The tomcat did not move, but I saw the flicker in his golden eyes, the briefest quiver in his scarred frame as he watched her. A heavy silence settled over the moment, and for the first time since opening the door, I realized what I was truly witnessing. This was not just a choice, it was a test of Hana's resolve, of her loyalty, of whether the pull of old ties could override the instinct that had led her here in the first place. Ayumi inhaled beside me, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break whatever fragile balance had formed between them. "Kaito," she murmured, her words laced with quiet urgency. "She's making her choice." The tomcat watched, unmoving. Hana lingered, frozen between two lives, two pasts, two futures. And I could only stand there, breath held tight in my chest, as I waited to see which one she would claim as her own. The space between them was thick with something weighty and unspoken, a battle waged not in snarls or raised fur but in silence, in the subtle, imperceptible shifts of bodies on edge. Hana was rigid, yet not afraid. The tomcat, battle-worn and weathered by time, held himself with a quiet certainty that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. This was not the posturing of a feral stray, not a challenge issued for dominance. No, this was something deeper, heavier, a presence that did not demand, but rather expected. And in that expectation, I saw the unshakable truth that made my stomach turn. He was not here for her. He was here for them. The weight of that realization pressed down on me like an anchor. Had I misunderstood everything? Had I believed I was saving Hana when, in reality, I had simply taken her from something that was never meant to be severed? The way she held herself, frozen, calculating, not recoiling yet not stepping forward either, sent a cold ripple through my spine. She was deciding, and it was not an easy decision. It was a war of instincts clashing within her, a pull between survival and something older, something more primal, an obligation etched into the very marrow of her being. I wanted to step forward, to reach out, to assure her that she did not have to leave, that she did not owe anything to a past that had abandoned her to the rain. But that same past now stood before her, unshaken, unrelenting, and though the tomcat's expression remained unreadable, there was something in the way he held himself that made my throat tighten. This was not a negotiation. He had come to reclaim what he believed was his, and in that moment, I felt the sickening uncertainty that I had no right to decide what belonged to whom. Ayumi's presence beside me was steady, yet I could sense the tension rippling beneath her quiet composure. She was waiting for me to act, waiting for a decision that I wasn't sure belonged to me at all. The air between us had grown suffocating, stretching unbearably thin as Hana's tail flicked once, twice, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a deep unease rolling through my chest. And then she took a step forward. My pulse slammed against my ribs, a breath caught somewhere in my throat. She was moving toward him, drawn by something I could not see, something beyond my understanding, beyond my control. For a brief, terrible second, I thought she would go, that she would walk past me, past the threshold, out into the mist-laden world where he waited. But then, just as quickly as she had moved, she stopped, her body twisted slightly, her head lowering, her nose brushing against the small, trembling forms of her kittens. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet in it something changed. The tomcat did not move, but I saw the flicker in his golden eyes, the briefest quiver in his scarred frame as he watched her. A heavy silence settled over the moment, and for the first time since opening the door, I realized what I was truly witnessing. This was not just a choice. It was a test of Hana's resolve, of her loyalty, of whether the pull of old ties could override the instinct that had led her here in the first place. Ayumi inhaled beside me, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break whatever fragile balance had formed between them. "Kaito," she murmured, her words laced with quiet urgency. "She's making her choice." The tomcat watched, unmoving. Hana lingered, frozen between two lives, two pasts, two futures, and I could only stand there, breath held tight in my chest, as I waited to see which one she would claim as her own. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with something lingering, something unseen, something that pulsed softly in the wake of everything that had just unfolded. Hana stood at the threshold for a long while, her gaze still resting on the space where the tomcat had vanished into the mist. The kittens stirred behind her, their tiny bodies pressing into each other, blissfully unaware of the gravity of what had just taken place. But I could feel it. The shift, the quiet finality of it all. I expected her to hesitate, to glance back once more, to second-guess the decision she had just made. But she didn't. She turned with the same quiet certainty that had brought her to my door that first night in the rain, and stepped back inside. It was not a retreat. It was not a resignation. It was a choice, one she had made on her own terms. She walked past me without a sound, settling herself beside her kittens with a grace that felt like something sacred, something ancient. Ayumi let out a slow breath beside me, her voice quiet, reverent. "She knew," she murmured. "She knew what she wanted." I nodded, unable to form words, still caught in the weight of what had just happened. I had believed that I had rescued her. But now, as I watched her curl around her young, her body forming the same protective curve it had the night she first arrived, I understood. Hana had rescued herself. I had only been a witness. And as I gently closed the door, sealing the warmth of the home around us, I realized that maybe, in some small way, she had rescued me too. Some stories don't have clear endings. They don't tie up neatly, they don't offer certainty, and they don't give us all the answers. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some choices are meant to remain open-ended, meant to make us think, meant to remind us that every life, whether human or animal, is shaped by the choices we make and the ones we leave behind. Hana made her choice. She wasn't rescued. She decided where she belonged. And maybe that's the truest kind of freedom any of us can have. If this story made you pause, made you feel something, made you think about the unseen lives that pass us by every day, make sure to like and subscribe for more of these stories. Also, please share the story with people you think might like them. Maybe someone else needs to hear it. Maybe someone else will see a stray cat in the rain and choose to open their door. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment to change everything.